Scott Grady. I'm here again with Sigong Tony Puyot, Tong Long master out of California. Hi, Tony. Tell us. I was going to say, when did you actually start training? How old were you when you started?
I was 13. It was in 1976. And I grew up kind of in a rough neighborhood, a lot of gangs and such, and wanted to be able to defend myself. So I started with Kempo karate, and gangs were a big problem in my neighborhood. So I started studying Kempo. It was the closest thing that was around. And
is that American Kempo, like Ed Parker Kempo, or was
so it was it was an offshoot of Ed Parker's stuff that had basically it went from Parker to in LA. If you're familiar with Kempo, it became BKF, the Black Karate Federation, and then it came down here as UKF, United Karate Federation. So it's pretty much standard Parker stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So when you started that, what was the next thing you progressed into in your training?
Well, so I was interested in Kung Fu, and I started studying monkey style Kung Fu and five animals with a guy named Mike Berry. He's somewhere on the East Coast still. And at the same time, I started studying Kempo and kickboxing at another place. Because the Kung Fu school never did any sparring or application. And I thought that would come later, but I was impatient, and I enjoyed sparring and application. And so I went to both schools.
And then how did you actually get into the Praying Mantis? How did you progress into that?
Yeah. So I kind of, my teacher left, and I continued the search. I studied a couple different arts, five animal Kung Fu from a branch of Douglas Wong's stuff. And I kept finding the same thing. A lot of teachers, when it came to Kung Fu, were just doing forms and really fundamental drills. And so when I found my teacher, it was somewhat similar, but it was the style seemed a lot more practical. And
who was your first Praying Mantis teacher?
His name was Stephen Lorette, and he had a little Chinese herb store in San Diego. Went in there, and so I learned some of the medicine, the herbology, and then various styles of not only Mantis, but Pekwar and Tai Chi and a few other things.
What's Pekwar?
Pekwar is axe style.
Never heard of it. It's new to me, so this is interesting. Tell me a little more.
Yeah, so I was quite obsessive, and I would hang out at the herb store. I'd usually get there around 4 p.m. after college, and then I would work in the store for a couple hours, and then I'd leave like 1 or 2 a.m, and that was 6 days a week. And my teacher didn't have a life either. He was a transplant from New York City, so we just trained constantly, and it was a good experience. It was I had learned a lot of different arts at that point, Kempo, Kaja Kempo, different forms of American sport karate, and they all served a purpose. But it wasn't until I found this teacher that I saw the depth of Chinese martial arts and the level of sophistication. And he was also unusual that he wanted me to study with anyone that knew anything, which wasn't common back then. And he also had learned Mantis from several teachers. And so he, for like a form, like say Bung Bo, very, very common Mantis, 7-star Mantis form, he had learned 3-4 versions of it. He taught me all of them, but he didn't say one was better than the other. He just explained what the teacher told him on the variation or the modifications of techniques and why they thought that was better. So it was really beneficial. I kind of credit him for teaching me how to learn
Hmm.
and how to analyze things and how to see the value of doing things one way versus the other.
And when you were learning with him, how did you? Is that the only Praying Mantis teacher you had, or did you move to another teacher?
No, I had a friend in Taiwan that was studying Mantis, and he would come back and we would exchange stuff. And then I later, early 80s, I moved to San Francisco and I studied 8-step Praying Mantis with my
Hmm.
8-step teacher, Sigong Long. And I lived with him for a short time and then got my own place in San Francisco and studied with him. And then in the park back then in San Francisco, all the different martial arts schools would be there on the weekend training. And so I used to go back and forth quite a bit with Brendan Lai, and
Oh, right.
we had
Some old
debates.
school.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. So
what was the style of Praying Mantis that Brandon Law did? Was it 7-star or was it?
he did 7-star Mantis.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was trying to remember what it was.
My 8-step Mantis teacher said, "Oh, Mantis uses a rope." Well, it's not that dissimilar to how you go to a CrossFit gym and they have the big ropes and they're weaving them back and forth. Well, this is early 80s, way before CrossFit, and we were using big ropes like that to develop the whip in our arms. So
That's
sometimes,
interesting.
yeah, I find that the more I learn and the more I research and the more science catches up, the more you get what they were doing in ancient times.
They just didn't have, in my opinion, they didn't have a way to. They had their way of describing what it is they were teaching or the idea they were trying to get across. But where we're here in a modern society where we've been taught from an earlier age more scientific type terminology or things like that about the human anatomy and what we call it today. They called something different back then, and it was their way. And I think when we talked before, when I was talking to you on the phone, we had talked a little bit about how some of that lost in translation and over time has happened.
Yeah.
So I believe you were a police officer, correct?
Yes, I did 23 years, and it was a good career. And it certainly gave me a lot of practical experience. So,
And did you ever were you ever involved in any of the DT teaching aspects of that through your agency or throughout law enforcement community at all?
yeah, yeah. So I taught defensive tactics. The name changes. Arrest and control, defensive tactics, whatever the name is at the current time. So I was an instructor for probably second or third year into my career. I started teaching and was a firearms instructor, and then I also trained building entries.
Okay.
So,
Dynamic building entries and stuff like that.
well, not always dynamic. Sometimes for patrol it's slow and methodical. And then if I was training the SWAT team, then it was a little different. A slightly different formula, depending on what sort of training and what the mission was and what they wanted to get out of it. So tactics was always a big part of you know what I did there at the police department. And then I had various detective jobs, and then I went on loan to the federal government, so I was part of Homeland Security for a number of years,
Okay. Cool.
working a task force, working cartels.
That's do you speak Spanish, I guess? So
I do. Yes.
Have you found that your traditional training in the Chinese martial arts has been a beneficial thing and useful to you in the defensive tactics in your own, not just teaching, but an experience when you're actually having to use whatever level of force it is for a particular subject? Did you ever find that a useful, like when you in hindsight go, damn, I'm glad I did that, or that's why I was able to do that type
Oh,
of thing?
absolutely. Absolutely. And so what I didn't touch on was prior to becoming a police officer, I was in security. So I was security, then I was a bodyguard, and then I went into retail security. And when I was working retail security, I was in probably 3 or 4 fights every week for about 10 years. It's a lot, it's a lot of fights.
It
And what
is.
happened, and the thing is, as security, the bad guy doesn't really take you that seriously, and you don't have a bunch of weapons and you don't have much backup. So it's basically a one-on-one fight or a two-on-one fight. And yeah, absolutely. I can honestly say my martial arts has saved my life, dozens of times where I
And
was,
sorry, I didn't
where
interrupt you.
I'd been, I mean, I had incidents with multiple attackers, people trying to stab me, had someone try to shoot me at close range, and I wasn't a cop then. And it was just, my skills against what they were trying to do to me. So definitely has saved my life.
So going into what do you, when we say traditional martial arts, what does that mean to you? What does that mean? If you had to tell me that, what does that mean?
So when you say traditional martial arts, I can only speak to what I believe in, what it is to me. So it's, what tradition are you trying to preserve?
Hmm.
And some people are about preserving the forms and the text in their purest form, as accurately depicting what was taught to them and maybe what was taught to their teacher and so forth. Um, my tradition that I want to uphold is the effectiveness of real combat
Hmm.
using the techniques that are passed on. And I think it is also traditional, if you go back, say, 300 years, that if a technique failed to work, it got replaced with something else or deleted.
Hmm.
I think that's the tradition, because no one that uses the art as a functional tool will ever keep something that no longer works or becomes outdated. And no one that is really faced with real combat will not add when there's a paradigm shift. And so it has to be relevant. And if it's not relevant, now the dilemma comes in where you get someone that thinks they know the art and starts changing it, but they really don't understand the application and how the system is used. And so they've got, say, 10 years on into something and they think they know it, and at the 20-year mark, and I've been one of those people where, I couldn't find the real answer to a technique. What I was told I knew based on my experience was not real. But lo and behold, I find the answer at the 20-year mark. And so my tradition is, one, to keep it real and practical, and two, to uncover what those techniques were really, how they were really intended to be used. And it isn't until you find really high level people or have a lot of experience fighting that those things reveal themselves.
So going back to you had like about three good points, and I hope I can remember them in order. Remember them. First one was the deletion in adding and changing things, even though it being a traditional martial arts. And so when I think about that, and I believe that's true. When we look at how things developed, if we look at a style like fa-jing, Wing Chun, two forms, three forms. Fa-jing traditionally has two forms, two katas or 2 sequences. Indian Wing Chun has its 3. And when you look at how they developed from when they first were developed to what we see today, there could be a change. Same thing with Sa Chuan. Are you familiar with Sa Chuan, long fist style?
Yeah.
From the Sao family, northwest China, from the Muslims. From the way that I was taught, or from what I was taught about the history of it, is that it originally had 6 forms, 4 to 6 forms, and now it's got 10 plus the tan toy plus all this other stuff. And so, how did this get added? Why did this get added? So, going on that particular question, can you maybe elaborate on what you're talking about on why a teacher would do this and why this may happen in the martial arts? And is this a degradation of the actual traditional martial arts, or is it in a is it evolving? Explain that to me and what your mindset is.
Well, so my take is based on what I've learned and researched. There's a lot of misconceptions about what the art really is, and if you go back in history, you'll kind of get a clearer picture. If you go back 300 years, most systems had 3 to 5 forms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I teach 3. I learned probably 40. I teach the 3 original forms. That's it. Nothing more. So, excuse me. So if you go back to the Boxer Rebellion, okay, so we go back 100 years, the Jingwu Association, and then there was another association in the North, wanted to preserve Chinese culture and Chinese martial arts. But at that time, martial arts was believed to have lost its value because now we have guns and all these famous boxers got killed. Well, it morphed, and that's when it started to morph. And it was long before we were around that if you only have 3 forms, that's not a whole lot of fun. And if that's the gist, if that has become the focus of your training, because to use it in a practical sense is no longer practical, and their view because of guns, then it becomes exercise, and it becomes entertainment, and it becomes something else that the focus got removed from combat. We can't look at it in a very simple form that it's an art and then it comes over here and we learn it. There's a lot of things that happen in China. There's, in the 70s, it was different and people did martial arts in China. And then I would talk to friends overseas or teachers, and they would say, no one wants to learn because everyone is going to school and they're trying to earn a living and they're trying to, a lot of stuff was happening in China and martial arts kind of lost favor.
Mm.
And so it just became a different thing. It evolved differently. And then, it made its way over here. And for whatever reason, whether a teacher didn't know or didn't want to teach, they just taught forms. Now, if you still go in places of China, you'll learn martial arts the old way, where you're just doing techniques over and over again, and you're drilling and you're doing it against a live opponent. And so when we talk about martial arts and MMA, traditional martial arts and MMA, it's not the material. The lack on the quote traditional martial arts, I think, is the training method. You can't do forms. They didn't do that in old China either. It wasn't just practicing forms. There was a progression of training for real application. And that is different. So you can have someone that trains something really basic, but they work on timing and distance and rhythm and range and all these other things that have to be in there that you have to know for actual combat. But if someone has good technique, but they can't reach the opponent or hit them or move with them or adjust with them, then they're going to lose.
Mm. So this brings up one of my other questions as well, kind of leading into that. Do you think that today, even Chinese martial arts or traditional martial arts is relevant, or should we, do this thing where we give up that that ideology or that ego or whatnot?
Well, I guess it depends on relevant to who, you know. If you, I guess there's places in this country where it's very, very relevant for application, you know, depending on your neighborhood and your environment, or you can be, you know, in another city where violence is almost non-existent and your chances of being in an altercation are slim to none.
Right.
And those are different things. I think there's always value in it with the other attributes you get, but from a practical sense, I really, as I mean, I will probably never be in a real fight again now that I'm retired and older and my world's different and I'm worried about where I'm going to go fishing next, or, you know, my next hunting expedition. Um, you know, but on the job, it was, you know, a weekly occurrence. So is it relevant? Yes, I think to a certain demographic, it's going to be relevant. And I think it is relevant, at least my students think so, that you know, they can take care of themselves and their families if something comes up.
And that leads me to the next question as well. Does MMA expose traditional martial arts to be impractical and not useful?
Well, that's a I don't think the question is that simplistic. I think it does. If you spar with, say, you take a traditional martial artist and an MMA martial artist, my bet's on the MMA guy. But it's not because of the material, it's because of the training method. And so if they had equal training method, I would always vote on the traditional martial artist because there are techniques.
What do you mean by training method? That's
when you let me give you an example. Say bridging, okay? And let me clarify what I mean by bridging. Bridging meaning you're going from outside striking distance to striking distance. That means someone has to move in, right? The guy moving in is moving in the range so he can get hit. So you go, well, what do we use to bridge? What do Chinese martial arts use to bridge? This was a question I had for many years. And so, you know, the only thing that I found was, okay, you throw a hand out there and hopefully engage. What does modern sport martial arts use? They use fakes, they use feints, they use distraction, they use timing. So they're using these other skills. Then I researched more and kept going. And then I noticed that traditional arts use position and angle to come in. So they put the enemy in a disadvantage. And some MMAs use this. If you watch any George St. Pierre fights,
yeah,
he'll do a stack step, move in, he'll come in at a 30-degree angle, which throws off the opponent's defense. He figured it out. But he started as a traditional martial artist. So, so then I realized that traditional martial arts don't use the fakes, feints, distractions, and timing. They've been added in the last 100 years. But I realized why. In real fights, people don't see these things. When people are charged up, a lot of times they don't pick up the feint because they're not sophisticated enough in their fighting. So you do a feint and then you think you're going to come in and use your strike, but they didn't respond to it. You may throw a fake, but they didn't pick up on it because they're worried about swinging for the fences. And so when you look at real combat, this stuff is almost a waste. It's better to use other tactics that are in traditional arts. And that was a big aha moment for me to say, why isn't this stuff in there? Well, it isn't in there because it doesn't work when people are just trying to kill you or, you know, beat you up. And there's emotion in it, and there's varying levels. Now, all things being equal in a sparring match, yeah, they're good tools.
And that's where, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
go from the top.
You're fighting against a trained fighter. I'm not going to use a fake. I'm going to use a feint. A feint is more subtle, and they're more likely to bite on it. And I can also use my angle change and come in at an angle, or I can bridge, with the backhand and try to get it engaged and get in the pocket and start working. So when I say training method, well, I don't know a lot of Chinese martial artists or traditional martial artists that will spend and create a drill to bridge. Some of them will. I know the sport karate guys did. Um, is there drills that you stay in the pocket and you're working things out? Is there a grappling drill? Is there, are we working power, measurable power, not just fantasy, but actually hitting something and developing that power? Are we doing good conditioning so our body can withstand the blows? And this stuff was all there, but it's mainly disappeared. So,
and that's so. On your perspective, would you say that would be a fair assessment of that on the traditional side versus the sports side of that in the MMA and versus the traditional guy?
Sure, absolutely. So when you put rules on anything, you change the whole dynamic, and it is irrelevant what style it is. I've always said there's a competition, what style does better. That's a silly thing. What's more important is what are the rules and how can you adapt to them, and that's how you win a competition. It's based on the rules and what you can do, and then where are those rules suited to you. Now you can have a traditional guy and but their training system is lacking, so if they could never get near a person, or there's maybe their footwork is ineffective, it doesn't matter. They're never going to win against the MMA guy if they can't catch him.
That's true.
Or they're never going to win if they don't know how to sprawl and someone goes for a takedown, or and so yeah, it looks all great on paper, but it's really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's two individuals, and there are things that I have to teach my students. If I don't know, I don't teach them how to deal with the tie clinch. That's nowhere in my system because the people that created my system never encountered that. Mm-hmm. Then you're not being current. If I don't teach people how to sprawl and counter a takedown, or how to get up off the ground or whatever, there's a problem. Now you're going to say, hey, this is my best student and he's beat everybody. And then some basic jujitsu guy takes him down because he doesn't know how to defend this, someone shooting in. Mm-hmm. It's not apples and oranges. There's more complexities, but as a general rule, it's always unfair to because again, like you said, it's always a sparring match against an MMA with the traditional guy. Well, then it's sparring. It's not what we were, a friend of mine, his name is Roy Harris. He's a well-known jiu-jitsu instructor, and he travels around the world. And he was one of the original first 12 people in this country to get a black belt in BJJ. And I was talking to him one day. I said, Roy, would you ever go on the ground in a fight? He goes, I'm quite comfortable. I think he's like a 5th or 6th degree BJJ guy. And he says, I'm very comfortable on the ground. I would never be on the ground. And I doubt anyone could get me on the ground, but if they did, I wouldn't be there more than half a second.
Why do you think he said that?
And then he was also a Wing Chun guy. That's what he started in. And he says, Wing Chun, oh, yeah, good art if you get to poke people's eyes out. And he said, but then there's other problems with it. So if you don't get to do that and you don't get to use your stuff for the things that you need to in that system, then yeah, it's handicapped. And that's what all these competitions or comparisons do. They handicap one or the other. I'll tell you something. I remember watching UFC I watched UFC #1 and #2 and #3 from the very beginning, and I watched it with some students. And I said, "Oh, okay, good." And I said to myself, Give him 3 years and it'll go back to striking.
And it did.
Well, it took about 10 years, but I basically looked at it and I thought, okay, once they figure out how to defend that one aspect. And so at the time it was that whole thing was set up to promote BJJ. I mean, they handpicked who the opponents were. It was
propaganda.
Yeah, it was rigged, and everyone knows that now. But there's a really good interview with Bill Superfoot Wallace on YouTube where he talks about he was the guy and how they handpicked who they were going to fight and who they didn't let in. But the thing was to promote BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, ground fighting, and it was real clear that once you neutralize that or learn enough of that, it's going to go back to striking.
Look where we are today.
They were, the argument was always 80% of fights end up on the ground, which is not an accurate statement, but 100% start standing up. And what is it now? It's a striker's game. It's all striking. And so it took a little longer to come around, and that's just the nature of fighting. So yeah, when we turn it into a sport, it mutates it. And it's just figuring it out. The people in MMA that I like were people like Anderson Silva. If you watch early, I remember seeing him spar in Brazil, and he's just playing light hands. And I told some friends, I said, that looks exactly like our sparring. Exactly, no different.
Going into my next question is, let's move away from the MMA for a little bit and go into let's dive into some of the aspects of traditional training. And one of the things is I'd like to get your view is, so one of the things in especially in Chinese martial arts, both of us being Chinese martial artists, we're taught our forms. And when we're taught these forms, we're obviously taught the techniques, or some teachers do. My teachers did. I believe yours did too. So tell me, do you look at the form as a linear type form, as it's ABC 1, 2, 3 type of a thing, meaning like in the form, if it's a basic block, punch, whatever, that's the only thing that it teaches you, or is there more to be dissected from that particular form and in its techniques?
Yeah, so I think well, again, these are just my opinions, but the forms are kind of like a suitcase of techniques. But what the way I like to explain it better is, if you learn music or you learn language, it has to be adaptive to what the other person is doing, especially language. And so techniques are like words. Well, you don't use the same words in combination, but there are some common things, words that go together that you use in sentences or use to communicate, because that's just what comes up. And the same thing comes up in fighting. There's certain things that are fairly constant, but then there's always other variables. So if you train it in this linear fashion, then you think that it's always this set combination of a string of techniques. Well, when is that sentence going to come up exactly in a conversation? It doesn't. And so forms, I train to teach me rhythm and to refine my technique and to program into subconscious. Because if you want an action to be without thought, the common scientific number is around 10,000. Or are you going to stand and do it 10,000 times? Well, I'm going to practice my form, say, every day, a couple times. And then, over the span of time, a couple years down the road, I've got my reps in. And then I'm also going to do it with a live person. And so my belief that the progression is that you do it solo. You work a technique, you learn it, you do it a million times. You do it with a cooperative partner in a two-person drill. Now you have range and distance and positioning and targeting and so forth. And then you do it with a partner in a drill that is uncooperative, and it makes it a little more real. And then you add a drill that becomes there's a couple variables on what they can do and what you can do, because that's the reality. You have to react. It can't be so rigid that it's known, because now you're at a different level in your ability to apply that technique. And then you're sparring with this whole suitcase of techniques, and they become alive. But if you didn't go through a process, it is impossible, in my opinion, to go from form to automatically, magically being able to use it in combat. So,
And going back to, like you're saying, you learned 40 some plus forms in your, how many years again? We're talking 40 plus years.
yeah, 40 plus years.
Like you've learned all these forms, but you've whittled it down to these are the three I'm teaching you. And because these are they embrace I guess the most of your system, and they translate what it is the points and that you're trying to get across martially. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So picture this. Say you have two forms. Okay. And you have to do 10,000 repetitions for each technique. If once you start doing the math, there's not enough time in a lifetime to get that done. That's only doing it solo. That's not with the other elements of training and learning to use it. And so, I know this phrase gets thrown around, better master of one than, better to master one technique than know 100. Well, the proof is in the pudding, and you can say it, but if you don't do it and you're teaching so much material, it's kind of silly. You're never going to get there. You're never going to reach the high level. And I know that I'm about, in my level, I'm about 4 feet tall and the ceiling is 8 feet tall. I got a long way to go. And I've been at this for 45 years, aggressively trying to improve. So if I'm here and I only do 3 forms and I'm trying to really master them to a high level, how is anyone else going to do it with all this other junk that they're doing? I learned Kaja Kempo. Are you familiar with that system?
I've heard of Kaja Kempo. I'm not. I know there's different forms of Kempo. I kind of know the background where it came from, but I don't know Kaja Kempo.
So Kaja Kempo was developed in Hawaii by 5 people. The main guy was Adriano Imperato, and basically they developed it to fight, mainly bar fights. And it was very stripped down, very violent, very hard. And it was all these teachers' experience of being in fights in Hawaii. And if you know about Hawaii, that a lot of people there like to fight. And so I learned Kaja Kempo, an old version, and it was very, very stripped down. And it was only techniques. There were no forms in it. And then one of my teachers, a guy named Vince Black, I was teaching at his school, and he brought Imperato over before his death because he was living in squalor. And, he was a hardcore dude. But his system was so stripped down, it was just to deal with basically a right cross, a jab cross, a knife attack, a club attack, and a gun attack. And that's it.
That was the whole system.
Excuse me?
That was his whole system.
Yeah. That was the system I learned. And there were 10 techniques for each. I think the gun only had 5. And it was designed specifically for what happened in their environment in the bars in Hawaii where they lived. And you ended it right away. And it was very brutal training, and all, like when you did 2-person exercise, you did full power, not to the head, but to the body. The punches were full power to each other. So you got beat up a lot, and, you just don't last. It was very abusive, so you don't go into old age doing old style Kaja Kempo, but as a young man, you can endure it, and, that was too stripped down. but it served a purpose and it was functional for their environment. So I said, well, that's the extreme minimalist. And then we have the 40, 50 forms as, you know, gluttony. So let's find where it is. And so what I did was I went back and I said, well, what did the systems have, let's say 200 or 300 years ago? They had 3 to 5 forms. And so my task was to find the oldest version of the 3 original forms in Mantis and what they were. So Bung Bo I've learned probably 10 times from different teachers. And then I've gotten the old manual, the oldest manuals that I could find, late 1700s, with the list of techniques, and going through and trying to dissect it and really trying to find out what it was. What was this art? You know,
that leads to an interesting question. You had mentioned to me before where you mentioned it earlier and also in our previous conversation, where you read something or saw something and were kind of under the impression of like, okay, what does this really mean? I think it means this, but is that what it really means? Do you have an experience that you can share with us about that?
Sure. So I was very interested, mainly probably because kung fu movies. You know, the hero always found a secret kung fu training manual. Well, and then he trains and then he beats the bad guy and whatever. Well, I like that story, but from a practical sense, there are a bunch of old training manuals, especially in Mantis, and they would say something and it wouldn't really make sense. One example of that is when they were talking about the eyes, and they would so I went into this study. I started with this aspect of the eyes, and I asked a lot of martial artists, where do you look on the opponent? What do you do with your eyes? And some would say, oh, you just look them straight in the eyes. And someone else would say, oh, I watch the shoulders. And someone would say, I look at the hips, and couldn't get an answer. And I'm thinking, well, this is a general concept, so it should be universal, but it wasn't. But I noticed in fighting, or especially in sparring, everyone kind of does the same thing. They figure it out, to varying degrees, of course. And so I asked some of the Chinese teachers that I know, and I had one teacher that always said, gaze at the opponent. And I saw that in some of the manuals that said, gazing at the opponent. What the hell does gazing at the opponent mean? I had another master from Taiwan. He said, oh, you just look through the opponent. And that's what he was taught. And so that's what he taught his students, look through the opponent. Well, I played with this, and then I did as much research. And then there was finally an Okinawan, I think it was Okinawan or Japanese, I'm not sure which, but wrote a very brief article. And he put enough in the article that I kind of gave me a direction. And then I went into science and I started learning about the visual systems, the peripheral and the acute vision, and how the acute vision was connected to the conscious mind. And so that's what you use to look at stuff and to decipher what something is and to read. And it moved fairly slowly. And the peripheral vision was connected. At that time, they said subconscious mind, but now most experts believe that it's another part of the brain that doesn't require any thought process. Mm. And so what I realized was gaze at the opponent and look through the opponent, what was in these manuals, really meant engage your peripheral vision. Mm. And so when anyone fights or spars with any experience, you'll know that they jump in their peripheral vision. But I took it a step further and I said, okay, well, now I need a mechanism to train this. I can't just say this because it doesn't work that good. And so I developed exercises and drills that taught me how to stay in peripheral vision and how to pop out of and go into acute when it was necessary. Now, you know, as a police officer, that you can fight in peripheral vision, but when you need to identify whether that's a gun or a knife or a cell phone or something, you have to go into acute vision.
Mm.
So so I had to develop a process and a training method, and it was a lot of trial and error and exercises and saying, oh, this is good, oh, this is better. This drill really helps, to where I got it really refined, that I could do this, that I could really develop skills in students, that they could stay in peripheral. And by having that knowledge, you can also learn to get your opponent out of peripheral vision. And I taught them, because you know what it is, and now you know the whole aspect and all the this, you can pull other people out of their peripheral vision and get them to engage their acute vision, making them very slow. So your peripheral and your non-thinking mind will always move faster than anyone's physical action. It's just way faster than any physical action. But your acute vision or your conscious mind will always be slower. So my is basically to understand what's going on and what's happening and how we can do it and how can I teach someone. So, you know, at some point many years ago, it became more of how can I teach better and quicker? How can I make someone better? And, you know, from being an instructor, you know, at the police department, you know, we learned a lot of adult learning concepts, and cops are not great students. And so you have to just, you know, if you can't teach the skill in 3 minutes, you know, and 10 repetitions, they're probably not going to get it. So you find different tools to be as effective as possible in conveying a principle that allows them to be able to do it. And so I do that with blocking, and I do that, you know, I learned some stuff from my 8-step teacher that's highly valuable in blocking and defense. And then it was, now let me do the back end side of find the science of it and why it works and what causes it to work. You know, you do a blocking drill, but how can you block everything and make someone quickly be able to do it? You know, and then so you know, it's, I mean, to me, it's not what I can do. It's what you know, the proof is in my students. And
I think any teacher would say that.
And when they can do it, you go, okay, it's not some magical skill that I have. This is a transferable skill, and it's quite effective, and it can be done in a very short period of time. And so efficiency is ultra important to me, because there's not a lot of time in life, you know. And I understand that maybe a more, if we'll call it traditional method, was the teacher wanted to know the student better and vet them over a long period of time to see their character. So, you know, it's, I'm really saddened by the fact that, so I'll tell you something, you know, we talk about these traditional schools. When, you know, back in the 70s, I started teaching at the YMCA, and I was 17 years old. I got permission from my teacher. They wanted me to teach there. And I'd been studying only 3 years, but they needed someone there. And I got challenged 3 times from, you know, I'm still basically a kid, by grown men that came in, watched my class, and then when the students were gone, challenged me. And then if I declined, then they just started attacking me. And in the 70s where I live, if you opened a school, you were going to be challenged, guaranteed. People were going to come in and fight you, other martial artists. And there was you know, it was a bit crude, but there was a quality control. So if you weren't real, or you know, I mean, you didn't have to win. I won those, but if you could just hold your own, then they said, okay, well, you're legit. And if you weren't and you didn't know how to fight, then your school got closed down, because you'd have people coming in every day. And it was it was a quality control back in the day.
Let's talk about, you talk about developing power. This is something that is real interesting that I think is lost in what from I experienced it when we're talking about fa-jing is what we're talking about, one of that area of development. And I want to get your take on some of the developments of fa-jing, how you develop it, and your views on it as it is, whether how you develop it and what you believe it is.
Okay, so sparring and doing techniques on someone in a demonstration, and they go, "Oh my God, that really hurt," right? Is a different thing. You know this. When you're in the streets and someone's on drugs or adrenaline, they don't feel things the same way that maybe a student does. It is a whole nother level, and the amount of force that you need to do is you need to take them out. And I think our predecessors long before us knew that you have to develop power. And so, you know, my teachers pretty much said you develop power, you have to get the mechanics right.
Mm.
And it's not one thing. So when my 8-step teacher was teaching me fa-jing, we did everything really elongated. Well, then I started using it, but the problem was it was too slow because it was such a long, large movement that I realized that has a place, but short, it's like you have to develop short power, you have to develop long power, you need to develop power in a circular motion and an upward motion, and the mechanics are different. So, the forms have the movements, and that's one of the things that defines the flavor of the movement. It's the application, but also the power generation. And so if you have this flowery I see forms all the time, Chinese forms, and I go, oh my God, that guy will get killed because he might hit the guy, but he's never going to hurt anybody with that. I was like Mike Tyson. Look at his mechanics. Now, we don't copy that, but we learn from that. Because if you copy that, then the fact that he's leaning over sideways, he's going to eat a knee. So we don't look to other arts to incorporate into our art. We look at other arts to see what they're doing to develop these attributes. And Mike Tyson, the way he rotates his shoulder and his body and he puts his body mass into it is critical for his power. So when you talk about power, if we go from a science perspective, it's mass times velocity, mass times acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to get the maximum acceleration, and how am I going to get the maximum mass? And it's combining these two things that teaches you how to do this. And from Kempo, Ed Parker was big on this. He was trying to figure out, he has like 20 different ways of power, rebound power, reflex power, all these other different formulas. And he was, I don't know that he had them all right, but he had some of them, the general idea. He was on that path. So, so when you apply power, your fa-jing is really, what am I doing it? What is the purpose of it? Is it upward? Is it downward? Is it circular? Is it linear? Is it long from a long distance, from a short distance? What's the variable of time that I have to apply the maximum power for this particular technique? And they're all
when you
slightly.
say, I'm sorry, I want to clarify, because anybody that's watching, what's fa-jing? Can you tell me what that is real quick, and then go back into that point, what you were making?
So exerting force, pretty simple. How am I going to exert force? Or I think now it gets more translated into power generation. Expressing power. How do I express this? How do I generate in a fist, the maximum? Say I have this amount of distance. How am I going to generate the maximum of force? Am I going to move my body forward, or am I just going to snap it? And that equation really gets tweaked by certain individuals that don't have a lot of mass, or some people will use more speed than mass, and some will use more mass than speed. And if you do the equations, it's a sliding scale on both sides, and it's finding the balance for who you are. So for me, the best tool is some kind of gauge that you can read impact when you hit it, because each person is going to do it slightly different depending on what they have. A guy that's 120 pounds versus a guy that's 240, they're not going to use the same formula.
Hmm.
And an example of that is when you watch, I used to enjoy watching boxing. You look at flyweights or featherweights versus the heavyweights,
Hmm.
a whole different fight. They're not relying on mass, and they want to knock someone out. So they're working for maximum power. But the problem is they don't have the mass. And so they're punching much faster.
Also,
Now,
they got an 8-ounce glove that's
yeah.
stopping some of that kinetic energy from going into you or being transferred.
So you have to even really develop more power, and so and so teachers have developed, a million different formulas for drills and exercises and weights, and there's the physicality to it, whether it be aided with, punching with dumbbells or whatever, but more importantly, it's the mechanics.
When you say mechanics, what do you mean?
I mean, integrating your entire body is much mass. So you can't, if you throw your arm out, then the only mass that you have is the weight of your arm. If you throw a punch, but I have better mechanics where I twist my shoulder, so now I have the mass of my torso. And then if I bring in my waist, and then if I bring in my legs to push off, then I am connecting more mass to my arm. So the mass part of the equation is getting upped, and I'm still maintaining my speed, hopefully. But if you time it where you're rotating all of this other stuff before the fist comes out, the guy's going to see it. So then it becomes impractical.
Mm. So
it's not just about maximum power. It's maximum effective power that can be used against a live opponent. And so you have a lot of drills that go, okay, I'm coiling I know you can't see it, but okay, I'm rotating my foot, I'm integrating my knee. Okay, now I'm rotating my hip. Now my back is spiraling. I'm now bringing in my shoulder, and now my arm's coming out. Okay, well, the guy's already gone and went to coffee. So can you tighten that up and get the mechanics to where all those almost work simultaneously? That it's just as fast as your other punch, but now you're integrating your mass.
So then that would be the argument, I think, that I could hear from the opposing side. Okay, well, that's a finite motor skill. It's not going to work because you can't apply it because it's a finite motor skill. It's too much moving parts in order for you to be able to generate that power. So why learn it?
Well, I think that's a stupid argument because, the finite motor skill and the gross motor movement argument is great for John Doe that doesn't know how to do something that's going to train for a week or a month or whatever. Okay. Anyone that does anything repeatedly and it's costly will do it. And I don't say it becomes a gross motor skill. It becomes a reflexive motor skill without thought. You don't have to think about it. It's kind of like a cop that draws a holster, or if it's whatever, I don't know. I kind of joke. It's like a Filipino pulling a knife out. No matter where it is, it's just going to come out before you even know it. So, yeah, you do it because do you want power? Do you become, and the other thing is, are you a martial artist for 3 years, or are you going to be one for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? You have to build up. If you went to work in a company and you started at the bottom floor, you don't intend to stay there. You intend to move up to the top. And so a lot of these skills, maybe they're not so functional in the first year. Maybe they're very practical in the second year. Maybe they're an awesome tool in the third year. And you have to think in those sense that not everything that you do right at this moment has to give you dividends. It's a process, and those that stay in the game will benefit from that.
Because that goes into longevity too, as a martial artist.
Yeah, and so when people ask me about this power generation and mechanics, I use one drill all the time just to get people to open their eyes. I'll tell them to punch my heavy bag, and it's not one of those bags that just flies away. And so they punch it, and it swings a little. And I said, no, punch it as hard as you can. And they punch it. And I said, so then I have them move up and I have them use an inside elbow. And I said, hit that about 10 times. So they do that. So then I move them back and I say, now punch that thing. And all of a sudden the bag goes flying with a regular punch because they learned how to engage their shoulder and their waist and their back, but they weren't using any of that in the beginning. Well, there's a clear example of how instantaneously they realize that if I use more of my body, I can generate more power.
That's a good tool. I like that.
Yeah, and so I try to incorporate as many things to where the student discovers that there's a better way to do something, and and the more tools like this that I have, the better I'm going to be as a teacher to convey that, look, this is power. Because everyone thinks they hit the bag really hard. It's this macho thing. I can hit the bag, and it's like, you have no clue. Someone that can really hit the bag, all of that is understanding what it is. So a lot of my teachers call that rebound power. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but and then they would say, well, it's like when you bounce a basketball. It comes back pretty hard. Well, it goes down, it compresses, and then it expands out in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, when we talk about the current state of martial arts, traditional martial arts, is there, and I think you alluded to it, there are so many schools that imitate the rebounding power, but they don't do it right because they don't know exactly what they're doing. They just think they're stomping or making a movement and don't understand that this is all to generate power. Like I said earlier, the form teaches you the technique and how to generate power out of it, and teaches you other aspects of fighting. So if you don't really understand the form and its application and its movement and what you're trying to accomplish with that movement, you get nothing out of it. And so it's just a shell. It's an empty shell of junk that you go try to use and can't use. And that's a good example right there of, if you know what you're doing, it's a very powerful tool.
Going back into what I was trying to get into, that this isn't some magical, mystical, let me sit here and meditate and I'm going to float and, wave my hand in the air and then magic happens. It's not. It just isn't.
Yeah. And unfortunately, so I have a lot of people that have come to visit and train with me over the years, different teachers. And they, a lot of them really don't want to see the truth. I can show them where they're flawed. They're half my age. I always joke that I'm an old fat donut eating cop. And we play, and I can tell them what they're doing wrong and hit them and just show them very like, look, there's a major opening, or you're making this mistake, so you're always open to this. And they just don't hear it. And they want to play Mantis like it's straight out of the form. And I go, look, I can show you every single thing I've done is in my forms. It's just not in that order that you see it in.
That goes back to the linear, what I was talking about by linear. Like forms aren't linear. They're linear in the way we teach it, but abstract in the way that we use it and apply it.
And I wouldn't even say it's linear in the way I teach it, because you can be with me for 2 or 3 years before you even learn a form.
Right.
So
get down with that.
That's my teaching method, because the form is the shell. One of my teachers, an 8-step teacher, he was one of my Kung Fu uncles. He came and he wanted to, well, we ended up exchanging, but I won't mention his name because it's not polite, because he's my senior. So to trade is not quite polite, but he said, how did you learn this? You didn't learn this from your teacher on how you're doing things. And I said, I said, well, because this moves this way and this does that, therefore I have to move here, and it's got to be this. This is the answer.
Mm.
And I went through the whole thing, and he goes, show me more, show me. So we spent a whole day doing this, show me this, the art that he's a master of, right? And he goes, this is amazing. You've reversed engineered a whole martial arts system. He was an engineer. So reverse engineering is basically you take some whatever, a printer, and you want to know how it works. You take it apart and you identify and you go, oh, okay, that's what makes it work. And that's what makes this widget spin. And that's what makes this. Well, he said I had done this with a martial arts system because
Impressive.
in because the way I was taught, it didn't make sense. Just like you and I and every other martial artist said, wait, that technique doesn't work. There's no way that, so I had to go back and say, it either doesn't work because I'm not doing it right, or it's the wrong application, or there's just some other variable. So I had to find out. I'm going to keep it as pure as I can and find the answer. In most cases, it was the wrong application. Someone was trying to teach it as a strike, and it was actually a setup for a throw.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the so I have a litmus test to evaluate techniques and applications that people come up with, and it's fairly effective. But one of the things that I've used that I learned somewhere along the line was that when you want to understand an application of a technique, the transition between one move and the other is actually the answer. How you got there, not the end posture, but how you got there. And so you were talking about this where you're moving the arm. Well, here's the grab. That's the transition. Everyone thinks this is the end, but that's not the end. It's how you get there. It teaches you how to actually use the technique.
Mm-hmm.
And then the litmus test that I use is when let's say you're walking through, I do this and you do that and whatever, or you're saying this, and I grab your arm. I'm sure you've seen demonstrations where someone gets to use 10 moves before the person is just standing there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the real world, application is you get a move and I get a move. That means if you throw a punch and I block it, it's not my turn to go. It's their turn. If you use realistic timing, I don't get to go after I block. Why aren't they throwing the other punch? That's not real.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one move for one move, or if you do it in a musical sense, if you're musical, it's one beat for one beat. The only way you get an advantage is if you can move on a half beat or you steal their move. So if they punch, but I pluck their arm, I just took their next move. It's my turn again. So it's only one move for one move, and unless you steal their move. And then the other one is there is no mythical one-armed man. That means if you block and punch, they get to block too. Their hand is not dangling from their side, And so if they can block it, well, then it's probably not the technique and the form, because if you think of a form, this is someone's masterpiece. So the technique already has the counter figured out. So if it's a true technique, if it's a true technique, some master down the line has already figured out how to neutralize the counter.
I would totally agree.
Yeah. And so that's a very easy way for people to say, well, this is what it is. I said, okay, then do it move for move with someone. And they go, well, they block well, then why would someone do this? To be neutral, to be blocked, and then you attack and they block it. No, you're supposed to gain an advantage. That's why it's in the form. A lot of my students are martial arts instructors with their own schools in different parts of the country. And, they always ask me, how am I going to do this? And I go, well, if you train with me, first of all, you don't need to get beat up to learn to fight. And I know that that's the way it was when I was learning, but it's not necessary. And I also live in Southern California, the most litigious place in the entire world. There's more lawsuits in Southern California than the rest of the world combined. So, so, um, so I had to find an answer of how do I teach people without them getting beat up, which is another thing that was important to me, not for the legal aspect, but just to allow the geeky, nerdy student to be able to learn this without being a rough and tumble guy. And that's what I saw in the schools. It was always the tough guy that did well, and the other ones that were just bait for the other ones. And I didn't like that. And so when I was young, I'd get very nervous about violence. And so I wanted enough that I endured and sucked it up and, did it. But I didn't want people to experience that. And so I developed a training method for sparring that was basically a progressive stress inoculation.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the main problems with police training is that you teach them techniques and then in the real world it's all chaos. And they've never learned to deal with the emotional aspects of fighting. So when students learn to spar, I always do everything very slow and they slap each other lightly.
Mhm.
So but they always make contact. So if you don't block, you get hit, but there's still contact.
Mhm.
That progressively gets harder and harder. And then they wear headgear. And if someone is head shy or reacts overly, okay, you talk to them and you maybe tone it down and you get them used to it. And that's what an inoculation is, a small dose of what they're going to be receiving. And progressively, as the student progresses in the levels and the knowledge and the skill and the training, they're used to more and more contact. So I've had people walk into my school in past years and they see two of my advanced students beating the tar out of each other and laughing and talking about what they did over the weekend. And people can't realize how they can eliminate emotion and they're not mad and they're just joking around and having fun, but they're blasting each other. Well, that's because they have no emotional connection to the physical action. It is not violent. It's merely a puzzle that they need to figure out one another and figure out what best technique and what they're going to do and how they're going to counter. And all the emotional aspect is gone. And they're accustomed, because they're inoculated, they're used to the physical contact. And I think in a lot of schools, traditional schools, there's not much contact. And so they, again, go with a boxer or an MMA guy that's used to contact and sparring with gear. And if you see a traditional martial artist and he gets hit and he starts looking away, it's obvious that person is not used to any contact.
Mhm.
That's a clear sign that they're pulling their punches all the time and they have not learned to take contact. And it can be done safely with headgear, with mouthpieces, to where they can just take the shot and go, okay, well, I'm still here. I didn't like that and I don't feel good, but I'm still going to learn to fight because this is a combat art.
Mhm.
So I think we in the current state as traditional martial artists have holes in the game that we need to fill and say, what do we need to do to fix this problem and that problem and these things that we do that maybe aren't counterproductive. And we can do that without, I mean, one of the things I hate is when I see a traditional school using boxing gloves. It just bothers me because they'll use boxing gloves, but they're so big you can go like this and you can't punch me in the face. Well, in martial arts, I'm going to slip that punch right. I'm going to find every little hole.
Yeah, I only need this much space
Yeah,
to get the strike in. So
yeah, and
that's
so
a very good point.
the problem is it creates some bad habits. So then you got to weigh what the benefit is. Okay, you get to swing. Okay, so once in a blue moon, if you use boxing gloves and you swing for the fences on each other and you learn to exert full power on a human being, okay, that's cool. But to do it all the time, all you're doing is training yourself to do to create bad habits.
Mm.
So I like gear that's closer to nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I like headgear and mouthpieces because you can hit to the head a little bit more than without it and still get the training and not destroy everyone.
Mm.
There's a this is a longevity game, not you're not doing Muay Thai where if you get in your mid-20s your career's over because you're just physically destroyed. People always ask me, well, why do you need to be a higher level, or why are you still working? They think that I've reached a certain level that I should be quite happy, and I keep pushing and pushing even after 45 years. And my answer is, the better I am, the less I have to do to someone.
Mm-hmm.
The more skilled I am, the more, do I really want to hurt someone or do serious damage? Well, the less fear I am and the more skilled I am, the less of a threat it is. And so it benefits me in that way, you know. And you want to develop so you can teach your students to be at a higher level. Who
I
wants
think you said it the best too, that to shorten that line that took us, 20, 30, 40 years to come up with the answers for things, either through reverse engineering or finding the teacher to go, that's what this is. I think us shortening the amount of time that it took us to learn it, to teach another student that is the real answer.
Yeah, and then to the forms, one perspective or one way to look at it is, okay, I don't only do, oh, he only does 3 forms. Okay, well, maybe I don't want to go study with him, well, okay. As the Chinese say, okay, well, you have 50 forms, but your skill level is all the same. So you're building wide. So you're becoming a fat man full of forms. You do 3 forms, you grow up because your skill goes up, and your knowledge and the depth of knowledge and skill and ability in those particular forms is higher, not wider. So you learn to a higher level, or do you learn to a more volume? Volume, I'm not interested in volume. I get if some people are, but if it doesn't improve me to be better by focusing on 3 versus 30, then it's counterproductive. In Hong Kong, a lot of Mantis guys would train with Hungar because they said, well, Mantis has the speed, but Hungar has the power. So they would cross train. I don't agree personally with that process, because now you're expending time in programming other movements before you've programmed one style. So I would rather find things that would develop those things that are missing maybe in the training curriculum to develop that. But I do believe that once you've really got a system or a style, as you call it, a style, and have learned it to a really good degree, then you can move on and learn another style and program those. But mixing before you're there, I think, confuses your programming on how you function. That's just my personal belief. So, but I am quite familiar with that, because back in the old days, everyone was like, oh yeah, why do all these Mantis guys know Hungar? Because that's what they did. That was the process of getting speed here and power there, and maybe something else somewhere else. And I just I don't find it as efficient as it could be. You have to stay current. So back in '94, I started training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and any of the instructors that studied with me, like other instructors from different places, I always just said, go and get at least a blue belt in BJJ. And they thought that was odd. And I said, well, we don't have anything. You can look as far as you want. We don't have anything. You could probably, come up with some BS answer of something that you have in your system, but when you get against a good jujitsu guy, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that you think are helping you, and all you're doing is feeding into their trap, just like they do. They do certain takedowns that you go, oh, thank you very much. You gave me this. You gave me your neck. I'm not just going to grab you. I'm going to hit you and do a brachial stun and knock you out. So, so there's a point where you look within your art, but then you just got to know. That's why you do wrestling, and you get a good collegiate wrestler, and he's probably doing knots before you know it. And you're like, well, wait, I'm a martial artist. Yeah, but you didn't have an answer for that. And that doesn't mean you have to adapt wrestling. You just have to figure out what you do to counteract it. Okay, he's going to do this. I'm used to an arm drag. I think wrestlers always do, that arm drag across, and I got to know how to defend that and stay on my feet and hit them. Okay, I got to know how to sprawl so someone shoots. That's not a big deal. So you don't have to do their art, but you gotta, basically pressure test your art and find answers that keep you out of trouble, so you're not vulnerable to them.
That's Miyamoto Musashi said it best: know your enemy and know his sword.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to know your enemy. And so I'm going to have someone bigger and stronger guys doing arm drags on me, and then see if they're going to snap my neck forward and then and then cradle my neck. And it's like, okay, I got to figure this out. I got to figure this out. I was sparring in LA a long time ago with this guy named Mantis guy, Christoph Krischuk. And Christoph was a full contact champion in Europe. And so we're sparring, and just because he was so stylized, I was finding holes, and I was popping them fairly easily. But he hooked my neck and dropped it like a single hand tie clinch. And I got out of it, but it took me about a second and a half. He would have already wiped me out. That was the honest truth. I got stuck. I paused. I didn't have an instantaneous counter for it. And he goes, oh, I just got that one thing. And I said, no, Christoph, I didn't have an answer. I said, if that was the only exchange we had, you would have brought your elbow in and knocked me out. And I said, can you do it to me again? Can you do it to me again? So we spent the next 20 minutes changing position, and I said, no, yank the shit out of me and really get me in that. And then I finally, I was like, okay, what do I have? And I found the answer, but I found the answer that day. I didn't have it before then. And
so if you'd have been presented with that in a real world situation,
well, if that was the first move out of a real world situation or a grappling incident in a bar where someone just hooks my neck like that, then I lost. Didn't matter what I knew, and the same with a sprawl. If you don't know how to sprawl, I knew from an early age, because I dealt with a bunch of wrestlers when I was young, I could at least sprawl or separate my feet and just stop them or stuff them. But I would just have better and better people shoot on me, and then create an exercise where it's just not the shoot, it's striking, then shooting. So it's not predictable, and develop that skill and that reaction. So we don't have to go to those arts, but we have to experience them, and we have to experience them by good people, by higher level people. The higher level people that you get from those arts to play with you, the better it becomes real. Yeah, I have a lot of friends that go, well, I'll just do it. And I always call BS. Like, well, I'll get them on the ground and grab them on the nuts. Well, they've already choked you out or broken your arm because you did something stupid. That is a viable answer, but you got to know what you can't do. So just speculating, and that's why I always told my students, and a lot of them now have their black belts in BJJ also. So they're not exactly where I wanted them to go, but it's okay. now they fully know the ground, and they fully know the stand up, and now they morph their stand up and their mantis to say, hey, I have a ground proofing curriculum. Basically, this is what I need to do. This is an extra part of the curriculum that I need to add so that we don't get taken down, or so you guys don't get taken down. So, and that's how you stay current, and that's how you pressure test and stay current and make it real. So,
well, I'm gonna close with this. We've been probably, I think, about 2 hours. It's been a very good conversation, and I hope you'd be open up for some more conversations, and probably some more targeted conversations, like talking about maybe one particular area of a technique or development of something, and hopefully to save some of that knowledge, like talking a lot more about your focus drill and that focus thing we were talking about before, or something like that. I think it's a wealth of knowledge that we need to we need to somehow have that people can have access so they can hear it and they can learn and apply this into their styles or whatever system they're training in. So thank you very much, Tony. I'm going to go.